just want to talk then a little bit about, as the last section, how we aim to scale up this blueprint. So the first bit here is just really talking about the idea of the innovation diffusion curve that you may have come across elsewhere. It's talked about a lot, certainly in the startup world. And it's really this idea that almost every new idea, concept, technology passes through this wave. And that there are different segments that you can break it up into. So we have the innovators in the first 2.5%. Typically the first people to come into contact with a new idea or technology. So the fact that you're all here suggests that maybe you're in this camp, or perhaps the next one, which would be the early adopters. And so those two groups are the kinds of people who maybe are a little bit more willing to forgive something not being 100% perfect or working 100% efficiency straight away. What is typically the challenge, however, is going from the innovators and the early adopters to that next segment, which is the early majority. And so that's typically known as crossing the chasm, which is in the sort of startup world as a challenging thing to do. But I think what's particularly interesting about this, and I think it's worth bearing in mind, is that the theory suggests that we move through these different segments in sequence. So you're never going to get the laggards on board with something first. So if you think you might have a friend who's still using a brick phone from the 80s, the sort of person who will never be the first one to do something new. Similarly, the late majority, so they will only do something when it's been validated by everyone else, the first 50%. And the early majority will only use a new technology platform or sign up something new when it's been validated by the innovators and the early adopters. Now, I think, so if you look at something like, you may be familiar with the Extinction Rebellion movement, so their key concept is that they need 3.5% of the population, which isn't too far off this 2.5 innovators, which has been proven. Some data suggests that that's kind of the number of people you need to rebel against a regime in order to overthrow it. So I think that's kind of interesting that it follows this same path. But the reason I mention all of this is that with anything new, you don't need to convince everybody straight away. And I certainly know from my experience in the climate change arena, I've probably spent too much time debating with laggards that climate change is real. So I guess one of the things I want to just flag here is thinking very much about who are those innovators, who are those early adopters, and focusing time and energy on them. That's the most efficient strategy. So what is our adoption strategy? Well, first of all, it's making sure that those who donate early in the process, some of the terminologies I'm using here are a little bit like from the world of startups, because in a way this is a bit like a startup. It's just a not-for-profit where our business plan is try to create a better system rather than build a product. But ultimately those who are supporting it early are taking on the greatest risk. So it seems only fair that those coming in early are also benefiting the most. So we've designed it such that early adopters benefit from those that are coming in later, so that it is fair across the board. We talked a little bit about gamification, so gamifying and rewarding user actions that help us achieve scale. That has worked very well for a number of technology companies out there. In particular, there's one called Ant Farm that is apparently one of the most successful Chinese apps ever. We have borrowed their tree idea for there. Ultimately, though, if we go back to that innovation chart, it's going to be about reaching other people who can help amplify the message. And as you may have seen, it turns out that everyone now has realized that we need to do something about the environment, which is good. So there are plenty of people with far more reach than myself, or probably any of us, who can help us amplify our message as we go. But ultimately, this is something that is very much about empowering the members of the community to take ownership of it and run with it. This is not something that I own or that anyone else involved in this project owns. It's a project for the community. And so that's very much something that we've tried to think about in our design, and we'll be trying to improve as we go. Now, one of the other things that we mentioned a few times is this kind of tension almost between the local and the global. And I think that our key to success is going to be in our ability to balance those two things. So one of the key roles that we see for the Interdependence Agency is aggregating those stories and telling the local message, but at a global level. Meanwhile, it's much easier for people perhaps to work in communities to be achieving tangible, real-world things that they can touch and feel. Okay, so this is sort of in the spirit of Elon Musk, who produced a secret master plan a few years ago. So this is essentially our plan in a few points, summarized as a few more bits and bobs in the background, but this is more or less what it is. So recruit, train, and support volunteers who can help us grow the movement through programs like this. Connect people who want to take action locally and globally through the technology platform that we're building. And I think what's really inspiring is that I think more and more people do want to do something. They just perhaps don't know exactly what to do. To then crowdfund the development of sustainable infrastructure assets. So that's donations from private individuals. To then issue interdependence bonds in exchange for those donations, which hold a value because they're based on the value of the assets. And then to use that money that has been donated to unlock co-investment from institutional investors who really do hold the vast majority of the world's capital. And that's how we will achieve scale. And then lastly, once we get to a sufficient scale, and this could well be our technique for crossing the chasm to scale to the mass market of people who maybe don't really want renewable energy, don't really want to do anything about climate change, but actually they'd be quite happy if they were getting paid in whether that be renewable energy or locally produced food to be getting involved. And so really the idea of a universal income being funded by the yields generated from this project. I have put the caveat there of once sufficient scale is achieved, we're talking in the trillions in order to finance that, but that is the long run objective.